The sound of rain is a patient companion. It lingers, it gathers, it softens the edges of the world. And on this quiet morning in London, in the years of Edwardian peace, it falls gently on the roofs, settles in the narrow gutters, and gathers in the hollows of the cobbled streets. Greetings, my beloveds. The day begins in silence. The sky hangs low, pressed down by a heavy blanket of fog. The rain does not rush, it does not hurry. It taps lightly on the window pane. It rolls down the lampposts. It spreads in puddles that barely flicker in the glow of the gaslight. Each drop seems leisurely, part of a rhythm older than the city itself. The gaslights, still lit from the previous night, glow in pale halos through the fog. Their light bends in the puddles, shimmering like fragments of another world beneath the surface of the street. A horse-drawn cab passes slowly by, its wheels hissing through the wet patches, its hooves clinking evenly, and the cabman, hidden under the brim of his hat, his shoulders squared against the weather. It is not a dramatic morning. It is not marked by ceremony or event. And yet, in its mundanity, it is rich in detail. Every drop of rain, every muffled sound, every quiet conversation between strangers in a cafe or a newsboy on the corner creates the texture of a city resting in its routine. Edwardian London is held in a certain balance. The pace of modern life is quickening. But there are still more horses than cars, and the lamps are still lit by gas. There is electricity now, and it penetrates living rooms and train stations. But its glow has not yet washed away the softness of the streetlights. The streets are alive with a mix of old and new. With cabs alongside cars, bowler hats beneath umbrellas, with the quiet resilience of a city that bends with time but does not rush to meet it. The rain itself seems timeless. It falls as it always has, on brick and slate, on wool and leather, on newspapermen and passengers. It envelops London in a shroud of quiet patience. Even the bustle of market stalls, half covered with tarpaulins to keep out the mist, takes on a slower rhythm. The voices of the vendors, usually harsh, soften under the patter of the rain. Listen closely, and you can hear the faint squelch of boots on damp pavements, the sighs of horses exhaling steam into the mist. The occasional whistle of a constable on the corner is heard, sharp but quickly swallowed up by the mist. Bells ring faintly in the distance, marking a time that seems stretched out, blurred by the weather. And in this softness, this ordinary morning, where little is required of the imagination except listening, there is solace to be found. A rainy day has the property of closing the world into smaller, gentler forms. A puddle, the glow of a lamppost, a folded newspaper, the warmth of tea in a small cafe. None of these things command attention, and yet together they form a rhythm as soothing as the knocking outside. Tonight, as we slowly immerse ourselves in this story, we will not rush. We will not chase events or search for great meaning. Instead, we will wander the streets of Edwardian London, softened by the rain. We will stop at the corner to notice the glow of the street lamps. We will listen to the muffled cries of the vendors. We will linger in the warmth of modest cafes and watch the umbrellas sway in the mist. It is just a rainy day, and that is enough. So let us walk slowly, leisurely, through the softened streets of Edwardian London. Let us watch the rain blur the boundaries of the world until even the sharpest corners become soft. Let us listen to the patient rhythm of hooves, the faint clatter of newspapers, the quiet whisper of the cafe. And in this silence, let us rest. And while you settle in, gently carried by this slow beginning. I remind you, don't forget to subscribe. Like and share your thoughts in the comments. It will help to continue this quiet journey. The sky was not quite dark and not quite light. That vague in-between of a London morning before the sun has made its decision. A pale gray mist hung low over the rooftops of Bloomsbury, draping chimneys and slate shingles like an old shawl. The kind of mist that seemed to muffle sound and turn the world into a gentle whisper. The rain had been falling since the very early hours. Not a dramatic storm, just a light, persistent drizzle. It tapped gently against windows and slid in narrow rivulets down the panes. Every now and then, a droplet would tremble on the tip of a rusting iron balcony and fall with the faintest of plips onto the stone below. Along Gower Street, the gas lamps still burned, though their light was barely needed now. Their soft yellow glow reflected in shallow puddles that had formed between the cobbles, making the whole street shimmer faintly, like candlelight flickering beneath glass. Few were about yet. A milkman in a heavy wool coat made his rounds, his cart wheels gently clattering, horse hooves muffled by the wet stone. A newspaper boy stood at the corner, barely older than 10, his cap pulled down low, calling out the headlines in a voice softened by the weather, as if even the news was too weary to shout. Inside a narrow townhouse, an old clock ticked on a mantel. Its chime, when it came, was not loud, just a mellow tolling that marked the hour in a house still half asleep. A cat stirred on the windowsill, stretched luxuriously, and went back to sleep, lulled by the rhythm of raindrops. This was how Edwardian London often began on such mornings. Unhurried, reluctant, and wonderfully quiet. The parlor was dim, lit only by the soft diffusion of light filtering through lace curtains. The wallpaper, rose-patterned, though a little faded, seemed to glow slightly in the early gray. The hearth was cold, but someone had laid coals in anticipation. The fireplace would be lit later. On a small table by the bay window, breakfast was being prepared. A pot of tea steamed gently, scenting the air with bergamot. Next to it, thick slices of buttered toast lay beside a small dish of marmalade, the kind with real orange peel, slightly bitter and sticky. The china was old and delicate, with a faint blue floral pattern worn smooth by generations of fingers. Outside, a slow procession of umbrellas moved past the window. Black, mostly, a few navy or deep green. Their owners trudged along with stoic resignation, boots splashing now and then in unseen puddles. There was no rush. In Edwardian London, there was a particular rhythm to mornings like this. The city yielded, rather than resisted, the rain. In the parlor, a man sat reading a letter by the window. His glasses steamed slightly with each sip of tea. The letter was nothing urgent. Just news from a cousin in Kent about the weather and a new piano in the sitting room. He smiled, folded the page, and returned it to its envelope. A clock ticked softly. Somewhere downstairs, a maid carried a pail of coal across the tiled kitchen floor. Her footsteps were deliberate, each one echoing in the quiet house. Soon, the fire would be lit. Soon, the city would wake more fully. But not just yet. Not before one more cup of tea. Not before the rain decided to let up just a little. By mid-morning, the mist had thinned, but the rain lingered. A soft, steady drizzle that turned every surface glossy. The Strand, normally bustling, seemed calmer in the wet. Horses' hooves clicked gently on slick cobbles. Carriages moved slower. The wheels cut little streams through the puddles and sprayed up tiny arcs as they passed. Along the pavement, gentlemen in top hats shared narrow space with clerks and errand boys, their coats damp at the shoulders. The scent of wet wool lingered in the air. Shopkeepers stood in doorways, watching the rain. Some leaned on broom handles, others smoked pipes and offered nods to passing acquaintances. Bookshops were especially inviting on such a day. In one near Charing Cross, a man browsed through a stack of gently used volumes, his umbrella dripping near the door. The shop smelled of old paper and leather, and the sound of the rain outside only made the silence inside more noticeable. Somewhere deeper in the shop, a cat leapt down from a shelf and padded away on quiet paws. Newsboys stood outside their usual corners, their cries dulled by the mist. A headline about a new law or a political speech fluttered in the breeze. Most people didn't stop to read. They had seen it before. Nothing too urgent. Nothing to spoil the quiet of the morning. A young woman with a red umbrella passed slowly by the theater district, pausing briefly to read a playbill for the Admirable Crichton. Her boots left small marks on the wet stone. She did not hurry. After all, she had nowhere she needed to be just yet. By late morning, the cafes had begun to fill. On rainy days, they offered shelter not just from the water, but from the weight of the damp air. Their windows steamed quickly, blurring the view of the street. From the inside, the city looked like a watercolor. Edges softened, colors muted. In one such cafe near Covent Garden, a waiter in a stiff white apron wiped down a table by the window. The scent of coffee, rich and earthy, filled the air, blending with the faint smell of wet coats and polished wood. Patrons murmured in low voices. Some read newspapers, others sat in thoughtful silence, nursing cups of tea or bowls of broth. At a corner table, two elderly ladies discussed the latest serial in the Strand magazine. Their gloves lay neatly beside their saucers. Occasionally, they would glance out at the street, watching the rain bead and slide down the glass. A young artist sat nearby, sketching in a leather-bound notebook. His coat hung from the back of the chair, still dripping slightly onto the tiled floor. He drew the curve of the sugar bowl, then the bent shape of a man reading a book. Outside, a man lit a cigarette beneath an awning and looked out over the street, the tip of the flame bright in the gray light. Cafes like these were never hurried. People stayed longer on rainy days. They read entire articles, not just the headlines. They stirred their tea thoughtfully. They didn't look at clocks. The rain was steady, but not unpleasant. Just steady. Just London. The bell above the door gave a faint chime as it opened. Not shrill, just enough to let the man behind the counter know that someone had entered. The newsagent's shop was narrow, with low shelves filled with newspapers, broadsheets, and periodicals stacked in tidy rows. A damp umbrella was closed carefully near the doorway, left to drip politely into a small brass tray. The air inside smelled of newsprint, glue, and a faint hint of tobacco. Behind the counter, the newsagent himself sat on a tall stool, trimming the edges of a parcel with slow, practiced hands. He looked up, offered a quiet good morning, and returned to his task. A gentleman in a bowler hat browsed the latest issue of Punch, chuckling softly at a cartoon about Parliament. A boy of about 12 lingered near the penny fiction rack, his eyes scanning titles with adventure and mystery in bold lettering. Outside, the rain whispered steadily on the awning overhead. The walls were lined with postcards, sepia views of Brighton, Bath, and York. Some were faded from the light through the window. Others had not moved in years. Beside the postcards stood shelves with ink pots, nibs, writing paper, and lengths of twine neatly coiled in brown paper boxes. A sign offered fresh ink mixed Wednesdays. The newsagent adjusted his spectacles and handed over a copy of the Illustrated London News. "A good read with tea," he murmured kindly, as if passing along not a product, but a small, daily ritual. The door chimed again as a woman in a hooded cloak stepped in and closed it gently behind her. Outside, the world remained soft and wet. Inside, the rhythm of a slower life unfolded page by page. The bell over the door gave another, gentler chime. This time, it was a different shop entirely. A draper's, just past Cornhill. The windows here were slightly fogged, their edges framed with lace trim and bunting in patriotic red, white, and blue. Inside, long wooden counters gleamed in the muted light, polished by decades of careful hands. Bolts of cloth, tweed, muslin, wool, were stacked like colorful, softened bricks behind the counters. A warm golden gas lamp flickered overhead, its glass shade clouded slightly with age. The air smelled faintly of linen, beeswax, and lavender sachets tucked into drawers. A young clerk in a waistcoat rolled out a stretch of navy wool across the counter. He smoothed it with the palm of his hand and waited quietly while the customer, a lady in a deep burgundy hat, touched the fabric between gloved fingers. There was no rush. She was still deciding. In the corner, an older woman sat on a stool, slowly winding a tape measure. She paused now and then to adjust a mannequin draped in unfinished calico. Its bodice was pinned with care, seams marked with chalk lines as pale as cobwebs. A raincoat, still glistening with droplets, hung from a wooden peg by the door. Outside, a pair of horses clopped past at a gentle pace, their hooves splashing rhythmically through the shallow runoff that curled along the curb. The lady settled on the wool. The clerk carefully wrapped it in brown paper, tied it with string, and handed it across with a small, respectful nod. No one raised their voices. No one spoke quickly. The weather had slowed everything to its proper pace. By early afternoon, the sky had grown slightly brighter, but the drizzle continued, soft and persistent. Along the Thames, the river moved slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the day's calm. It was swollen with recent rains, its surface a dull silver under the gray light, rippling gently beneath the arches of Blackfriars Bridge. The embankment walk was nearly empty. A constable in a cape stood by the railing, his helmet glistening with beads of water. He watched a pair of gulls circling above the tide, occasionally dipping to skim the surface. An elderly man with a fishing rod sat on an overturned crate by the water's edge. His coat was patched and his boots well worn. A thin stream of smoke rose from his pipe as he watched his line with patient indifference. Whether the fish bit or not didn't seem to matter. Closer to the footpath, a couple strolled beneath a shared umbrella. They walked slowly, their steps syncing with the rhythm of raindrops on their shoulders. The man carried a folded newspaper under his arm. The woman, a parasol that had not been opened. The sound of distant bells drifted from a riverside church. Their notes rang slowly, deep and mellow, swallowed quickly by the thick air. A barge moved down the river, its engine barely audible over the rain and water. Smoke trailed from its funnel, blurring slightly in the mist. London's river had always carried the city's pulse, but on days like this, it was more a lullaby than a heartbeat. Later in the afternoon, when the rain had soaked coats and curled the edges of newsprint, it was time for tea. Not in a cafe this time, but in a quiet Edwardian library. one of those hidden corners of the city that few ever hurried through. The door creaked gently as it closed. Inside, the warmth was immediate. A coal fire hissed quietly in the hearth, and the rich scent of varnished wood mingled with dust and leather-bound books. The library was lined floor to ceiling with shelves, their contents stacked in gentle disarray. A man in wire-rimmed spectacles sat at a long oak table, sipping tea from a plain cup. Steam curled upward toward a hanging lamp overhead, where moths occasionally brushed against the glass. His cane leaned against the chair, and a copy of the Times lay open to the art section. Nearby, a woman flipped through a book of poetry, her fingers turning each page slowly, reverently. A pocket watch on the desk beside her ticked in soft, deliberate beats. She smiled faintly at a stanza about spring, then looked briefly toward the rain-streaked window. The irony wasn't lost on her. In a far corner, a librarian cataloged new arrivals, her pencil scratching quietly on the ledger. She paused to refill the ink, then carried on with quiet dedication. The rain outside was gentler now, almost like a sigh. It ran in soft trails down the windows and made the gaslights shimmer in gold halos. In the library, time seemed to pause. The outside world, with its damp umbrellas and glistening curbstones, remained just beyond the glass. Inside there was tea, poetry, and the comfort of stillness. As afternoon slipped slowly into evening, the rain softened even more, now barely more than mist. Beneath the high arches of Burlington Arcade, time seemed suspended. The glass ceiling echoed faintly with the occasional drip, while shopkeepers stood with folded hands, gazing through polished windows. The arcade was dry, and the sound of footsteps was gentle. Leather soles brushing over old stone. A gentleman in an ash-gray suit paused outside the glove shop, admiring a pair of camel-colored kid leather gloves displayed on velvet. Inside, the shopkeeper stood patiently, ready but never pressing. Further down, a perfumery offered a whisper of violets and rose attar that drifted into the cool air each time the door opened. Bottles of cut glass stood like jewels behind the pane, and the brass fittings on the doors gleamed with recent polish. At the far end, an elderly couple strolled arm in arm, pausing now and again to study a silver pocket watch or an embroidered handkerchief. They spoke quietly, their voices as soft as the hush of the arcade. A young boy, dressed smartly in a sailor's coat, stood transfixed by a model train in a toy shop window. His governess stood just behind him, eyes on the clock, but without hurrying him along. Outside the arcade, the world remained damp and gray, but here it was dry and timeless. The arcade, with its soft gaslight and warm interiors, offered a kind of haven, an in-between place where nothing needed to be done, and the world could simply be watched go by. The sky was beginning to darken now. The gray had deepened into blue, and the rooftops of the city began to disappear into shadow. Gas lamps flickered to life along the streets of Mayfair, their flames catching in the puddles that lay like mirrors in the road. The rain had never stopped, but by dusk it had grown so fine it seemed like the city was simply breathing mist. The chimneys sent up slender wisps of smoke that curled into the air and drifted lazily across the skyline. A few windows glowed amber behind lace curtains, early lights of evening, soft and low. A lamplighter moved down the row of lamps, stopping at each one with his long pole, lifting the flame to its housing with slow precision. He wore a broad-brimmed hat and moved with quiet familiarity, as though he knew each lamp personally. As he passed, his boots left neat prints on the wet cobbles. In a quiet mews just off Grosvenor Square, a stable hand brushed down a pair of tired horses. They steamed gently in the cool air, the scent of hay and rain-soaked leather mingling in the twilight. In the loft above, a single candle glowed in a tiny window, illuminating stacks of oats and a folded blanket. On a nearby bench, a young woman sat beneath an umbrella, her gloved hands resting on a parcel in her lap. She watched the rain, not waiting for anyone, not reading, just sitting. The street behind her was quiet. A carriage passed now and then, but its noise faded quickly into the damp. Dusk in Edwardian London had a particular stillness. It was not lonely, just slow, soft, and expectant. Evening had arrived at last. The rain tapped steadily against the window panes of a terraced house near Fitzrovia. In the front room, supper was being served. Not a grand meal, but a quiet one. A bowl of mutton stew, bread thick with crust, and a pot of strong black tea. A fire had been lit in the grate. It crackled gently, casting flickering light on the wallpaper, which bore the faint pattern of ivy and faded gold. The ticking of the mantel clock was steady, a low metronome to the silence. A man sat in a worn armchair, spectacles perched on his nose, book resting in his lap. He wasn't reading just yet, merely sitting, warming his feet by the hearth. His dog, a spaniel with long ears and sleepy eyes, lay curled beside him on the rug. In the kitchen, a maid dried dishes slowly, wiping each one with care before stacking them in a sideboard drawer. The windows were fogged, and she occasionally traced a finger along the glass, following the line of a raindrop down to the sill. The house had grown still. From the upper floor came the faint creak of a floorboard as someone settled into bed. A wardrobe door closed gently, and a soft voice called "Good night" through a slightly open door. Back in the parlor, the man stirred from his chair, just long enough to add another coal to the fire. The flame glowed brighter, then settled again. It would burn for several hours more, keeping the room warm long into the night. The city had grown quiet. The rain, which had followed the day like a familiar tune, now tapped faintly in the darkness. Along the Thames, the gas lights glowed in tidy rows, their reflections shimmering in the puddles and pooling between the cobblestones. In a room above a bookshop, a single lamp still burned. Its glow was soft, barely touching the ceiling. A woman lay curled in a chaise beside it, her book open but forgotten. Her breathing was slow and even, and the fire beside her was little more than a hush of red coals. The clock on the mantel marked the hour with a gentle chime. 9 o'clock. In the narrow lanes of Chelsea, the rain had gathered into runnels that trickled steadily toward drains. Curtains had been drawn in most homes. The world outside was little more than blurred silhouettes and the occasional echo of a cab wheel in the distance. Even the public houses had quieted. A few figures remained hunched beneath their hats at corner tables, but the noise was low, more of a murmur than a conversation. The landlord refilled a lamp behind the bar, and the rain tapped gently on the windows. Elsewhere, children had been tucked into bed. Boots lined the hallway beside a warming stove. A small hand reached out to close a bedroom curtain, pausing a moment to watch the rain catch the light of a lamp across the street. Then, with a quiet sigh, the curtain was drawn. And so Edwardian London came to rest, under clouds, beneath gaslight, in the arms of the softest, most familiar rain. It was not a remarkable day. It was not grand or tragic, but it was enough. A day that asked for little and offered only quiet in return. And sometimes that is more than enough.